official welcome to our audience today. It is our pleasure. We have William Batchelder with us, and we're going to call you Bill. Is that all right?
That's fine.
That's great. Thank you for agreeing to be with us today as part of the Plymouth Historical Society's new initiative, Memories of Plymouth. We're looking forward to the stories and memories that you have about our town. It's important to all of us when we recall what a community is. We have two sets of questions. The first ones I'm calling just identification. A lot of people know who you are. They've met you, they've socialized with you. Some people know of you. And for those people who may not know you, we're going to ask you some very basic questions on your background.
That's fine.
First one, state your full name, please.
William Foster Batchelder.
Ooh, Foster. Is that named after someone?
Way back in the family, in the Batchelder side, yes.
All right.
Foster Smith Batchelder.
Where were you born?
I was born in Holderness, New Hampshire.
A home birth? Was it a home birth?
Yes, in my grandparents' home in Holderness.
Wow. And when did you move to Plymouth?
Oh, I always lived in Plymouth. I just happened to be born in Holderness.
Your parents' name, mom and dad?
Ella Fleming Batchelder and Lyman Foster Batchelder. There's a Foster again.
There's a Foster. And your mother was?
Ella Fleming.
And an elementary teacher at Plymouth?
Yes, and she was a Scotch emigre. My maternal grandparents were Isabella and William Fleming, and they came to this country from Scotland in the early 1900s. I think my mother was 5 or 6 years old at the time they arrived here. Wow. So there is that Scotch connection, and my grandfather from Scotland had his first employment was with a lumber distributing company in Lowell, Massachusetts, Pratt and Forest Lumber Company, and Aristes M. Pratt owned land in Holderness on Owl Brook. And the house still exists today. It's quite a grand home over there on the opposite side of the brook from where the highway is. And my mother and her sister and mother lived there for a number of years. So there was this Scotch connection, pretty direct. And my mother went to school in Holderness. She actually went to Plymouth Normal School and boarded in Plymouth at a home on Langdon Street. And she became a school teacher after that. And
should I interject to say she was my kindergarten teacher?
That's fine.
And your father, Lyman?
He was a laborer here in Plymouth, and he too graduated from Plymouth High School. He and my mother were in the same high school class. I'm sure that's where they met. And he was just a laborer off and on during his life here in Plymouth.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And your education in Plymouth?
Oh, I started school in Plymouth. I don't know whether there was a kindergarten program then. I think there was not. I went to first grade. It was Marion K. Seavey was my teacher.
Seavey, S-E-A-V-E-Y?
Right. And I attended, I think the fascinating thing for me was one of my very early grades, and it could have been second grade, was actually held in the hall where the clock is.
Rounds?
And that was, the rest of the classes were all held in what has since been called the Memorial School or the Spear School, whatever, the brick school at the corner of School Street and Summer Street. But I did have 1 year in Rounds Hall.
Can I ask a question? In Rounds Hall, were you on the first floor?
Yes.
Yes, on the first floor. So the children went to school on the first floor, and then the upper levels would have been for those that were teacher trainers, training to be a teacher. So the elementary school was and is called Guy E. Spear Elementary School.
Oh.
All right, great.
And I did all my eight grades there, and then went to the high school. I think the 8th grade may have been in the new school that has become an administration building for the college.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the one I mean on the corner of High Street in summer. I can remember being there, and I have to tell you, if I were there, it would have been just for maybe the 8th grade. I'm not certain on that. And then I went to the high school, which was the building across the street, a building that was built, I think, around the time of the First World War. I'm not sure. But all the schooling I went to before college was in the local school system.
This is connected a little bit with World War II, but you finished high school early.
Yes. There was a program offered in the early 1940s that permitted people, if you had a certain grade level or whatever, to try to get a year of college in before we went into service, because going into service was pretty much expected and automatic in those days. So George Ray and David Breck from Wentworth and I took the tests, and with some, assistance, measured up, I guess, and we left Plymouth High School halfway through our senior year. And I had turned 17 in October, so I started in college when I was just 3 months in my 17th year.
Wow.
And I went to the University of New Hampshire, where I was accepted. And I walked in, as did all three of us, along with others similarly situated, into the second semester, which is kind of a challenge when you go from high school, not into the first semester, but into the second semester. And I remember that very well. And the three of us finished 1 year of college before we all went in the service.
Wow.
I mean, going in the service, if you could, measure up to the physical test, that was a given. That's where we were all going.
But you made the comment that it was an expectation for men and possibly women, once they graduated, they would move into the service because of what was happening
Yes.
in the world at the time. All right.
The draft was underway. I can remember the Secretary of War, I guess, Henry L. Stimson, was on in the newsreel in the movies, pulling out the first draft number, and then after that it was all just a matter, you either enlisted or you were drafted if you could get past the physical.
We're going to switch to your career and start answering some questions relative to the positions that you have held over time. If possible, maybe what was your first career position?
My first career position was that of a young attorney starting out in a legal career with Bill Maynard, and here in Plymouth. And he, of course, had been formerly partnered with Anwar Samaha, and Sam had left to take on the clerk of courts position, and I started out as a young attorney with Bill Maynard. I had a chance to, I was asked to join a firm in Manchester, and I had met Betty at the time, and we had met on the ski slope of Waterville. We got on the T-bar at the same time, and she was not excited about living in Manchester and one thing or another. So I stayed in Plymouth. I did not take the position in Manchester. And having stayed in Plymouth, I practiced law for a period of time, and then as others had done in the past, Hazen Sturtevant, a Plymouth lawyer, and Robert Jones and Charles Tesreau, I became county attorney, which meant I prosecuted criminal cases as not a full-time job, but as part of being a county attorney. And I did that for 6 years, and then returned to completely private practice. And then I was appointed to the trial court in New Hampshire, the Superior Court, when Justice Leahy retired in it was 69 or 70. And I became a justice of the trial court, a position which I held for 10 years. And then I was appointed to the state Supreme Court, the highest appellate court in New Hampshire. And if there's any pride in the appointments, I can say that I was appointed to the Superior Court by a Republican, and I was appointed to the Supreme Court by a Democrat governor.
Playing both sides of the aisle, huh?
Right.
I think I'd like to interject a question. You live in a beautiful house on Fairgrounds Road that has some rich history. Would you mind telling the audience a little bit about that?
Well, the house at one time was owned by Nathaniel Peabody Rogers. He was a lawyer here in Plymouth, and he came from a family of some wealth, and professionally he was a well-regarded lawyer here in Plymouth. But there came a time when he moved his legal associations to defeating slavery. And he was an anti-slavery, very early on proponent, and made his career thereafter dedicated entirely to the abolition of slavery. He became a national figure. He moved his family to Concord, and they spent many years there that weren't all that comfortable a time for them. And he went to London, and it was a conference, one of the first conferences where men and women were gathered together in the same social motion and movement. And it was anti-slavery all the way. And when it came time to vote on one of the issues in London, the women's vote did not count. And he got up and walked out from the conference, because at the same time he was anti-slavery, he was also very much pro-female, becoming, equal in the professional world. And he was a very, very dedicated man, and he gave up a lot in his life to promote those causes.
So the timeline on that...
Excuse me.
The timeline on that would have been what, around 1850 or so?
Yes.
1850. Thank you for doing that. We're going to switch to some topical areas, and again, if there are any questions that you'd like to pass, just let me know. For number one,
Excuse me.
Living in this town as a child, as a youth or a young adult, is there any special memories that you might have as a child, as a young adult?
Well, I have to say that I did not spend a lot of my childhood during off school time here in Plymouth. I had a bifurcated childhood. I lived in Plymouth with my father and mother, and participated in all the school events during the school year. But the day that school was over in June, we moved over to the place where my grandparents were living in Holderness. They had become caretakers of a substantial estate called Woodcrest, and I spent my summers there. So I had this bifurcated, youthful growing up. I spent summers at Squam Lake in a different world, and then I spent the rest of the year here in Plymouth. So I don't think I had the normal kind of year-round growing up in Plymouth that a lot of kids did. Mine was different. And when I was in Woodcrest, I was in a different world.
Can you explain what that means, a different world?
Well, Woodcrest was owned by a man whose name was Thomas Wells Farnham. He was a treasurer at Yale College. And he actually had come to New Hampshire in the late 1800s and attended a camp, a summer camp, which might very well have been the camp that was originally in Holderness on what today is we call Church Island, Chicago Island. And later on, a professor from Boston University, I believe, tried to reestablish this summer camp experience and bought this property in Holderness, Woodcrest. And he couldn't make a go of it, but he went to one of his early campers, Mr. Farnham, for some help. I think Mr. Farnham gave him some money. It didn't work. Farnham had an experience in World War I. He was in the diplomatic events in southeastern Europe. And he wound up taking over the property from the professor from Boston, and he maintained it as a resort or a place to entertain his guests.
Fascinating.
So I had a very normal life in Plymouth like all the other kids in the school year. And in the summertime, I was over at the lake where this is in the Depression. My grandfather, Fleming, and I would ride in his Model A pickup truck to Roberts Market in Meredith daily and spend $20, $30, $35 for groceries.
A tremendous amount for that era.
For the farm and the people who were staying at the camps.
Oh, okay.
And they had two cooks, of course. They had a Catherine Radley, I remember, was one of the cooks. And I can remember one of the chauffeurs and I used to stand beside her on Sundays when she had a great big container of ice cream being made, and the chauffeur and I would cut up peaches and drop the slices into the ice cream and as we were making it, and then it would seal it up and then to finish the job, and we had all this fancy peach ice cream.
Whoa.
So I had that kind of a summer. And I met some fascinating people. In fact, I had an association with a young girl over there when she got the whooping cough one year in 1939, I think. And we got quarantined in August, and everybody left. So this woman, this young girl, who I think she was 10 or 11 years old, I was 12 or 13, and we were stuck there together for 2 or 3 weeks, and we played tennis every day. And she actually became involved in theater. She played the role of Mrs. Kinter in the movie Jaws, and Betty and I bought the blooming equipment to watch that movie because Winky was in it. Her name was Elizabeth Lee Beers, but her name was Winky.
Winky.
And Winky and I had to stay there for 2 or 3 weeks while she was quarantined.
Wow.
And this past October, she called me from Martha's Vineyard and wished me a happy birthday.
Oh, that's so delightful to hear. That's great. That's great. Childhood memories.
Well, my childhood memories, a lot of them have to do with the farm at Woodcrest.
Well, let me give you very specific topics if I can. How about anything related to weather? Were you ever here during a time that there was unusual patterns of weather occurring? Like hurricanes, floods?
Well, I remember, of course, everybody remembers the 1938 hurricane. I remember that very well. I was in 7th grade at the time, and our teacher was Mariette Bowles. And she was the daughter of Ella Shannon Bowles, who wrote the book, Let Me Show You New Hampshire. And that was a book. It was written during the Depression because the federal government subsidized people to write. It's like the mural in the post office. There was art involved, and there was conservation, environmental concerns with the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I just think that that little hunk of the Depression showed that at least some of America was concerned with conservation, environment, and the arts, and literature. I didn't answer your question, but I rambled.
No, you didn't, because this brings up the art that's in the post office. That's one of 7, I believe, projects that were established here in New Hampshire. Interesting, 2 were in Laconia. So if people haven't had the opportunity to get into the post office, next time when you see the mural on the wall, there's a plaque to the side, and it explains to you, it depicts information relative to the picture itself. So audience, please have a chance and do it.
So Mariette Bowles came to me and the others in the class in 1938, was it, or 9, and said we were going to get out early that day because there was a storm coming up the coast. And we got out, I guess, maybe around 1 o'clock or noontime. And of course, I went home and my parents put me in the car and we went over to the Woodcrest. I had a dog there, his name was Duke, and we went over there to spend the night. And I took Duke. Duke lived in the barn with a horse. He had a fine place to stay, and he had food out there, and a place, a bed, and all this and that. So I do have a distinct memory of taking Duke to the barn and noticing there was one heck of a wind blowing.
Wow, wow.
And it really was a stiff wind. And I was bending into it, and we came back. It was still daylight, so call it 7 o'clock or something like that. And I got in the house and, went to bed, woke up in the morning, and then I heard on the radio everything that had happened, and all the trees were down around the farm. And that was the 1938 hurricane, which was a terrible thing.
A couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Charlie and Mary Durgan, brother and sister, and
Yes.
they had some recollections on the fires in town. Can you recall the Methodist fire that occurred? Congregational church?
Yeah, I recall actually one prior to that, and that is the Fox Block, so-called. Plymouth Fox built his brick building down here on the corner of Main and Highland, east of the bank. He built that building, I think, it supplanted a wooden one that had burned. And that brick building, I think, was built in the late 1800s. I'm not certain, but it was named after him, the Fox Block, in the event. And I can remember as a little kid, and I had to be, like 3 or 4 years old, but the fire alarm and my father and mother getting up and my father leaving the house. And I know I burned myself that night on some spilled coffee. I remember that. And that was a night of a very substantial downtown fire in that block. And the building was refurbished and redone. And after the fire, of course, I think the builder was a local man. And Mr. Pease, who had married into the Fox family, Howell Pease, then owned the building. And I believe today, if any of you walk behind the Northway Bank and you look at the Fox Block and study the brick line at the top, you can see a shift in the color of the bricks. And I was told that the developer, the builder, and Mr. Pease walked the staging inside the building after the fire, and they kicked the bricks, and the bricks that didn't fall stayed. So the wall is not an even wall. It's a very irregular wall.
Interesting.
And I think, honestly, to this day, you can see that distinction.
We'll have to check it out.
So then after that, when I was in high school, I had a friend, John Lovering, who was from Wentworth, and for some reason he had stayed down that night. And there was another fire alarm, and of course that was the Methodist Church in the so-called Kidder Block. And I have a distinct memory of two things. One, the Plymouth Record had previously, within a year or two or three, but quite recent, had some insulation placed on their building, and their building did not catch on fire. It was close enough, but it was surprising, and that kind of acted as a cushion with respect to the Lassard block beyond it. So the Plymouth Record stayed with that fire very close by. My memory also is that when the fire department arrived to tackle the fire when it was first discovered, and it had started in the Kidder Block, the hydrant at the corner of Court Street and Main Street was frozen tight, and there was no water available.
So this was in January, early winter?
Yeah, I believe so. And I can remember my friend John Lovering and I standing on what was then the courthouse, now the town hall steps, and we could feel the heat from the fire that far away. And I can also remember that we, I believe, were present when that mammoth church bell in the tower of the Methodist Church lost its holding and crashed down, and there was this tremendous thump and thud. I believe we heard that. And then...
Did the bell survive? Do we know?
I do not know.
Okay. And how old would you have been? I don't believe I've asked, and you don't need to answer. Are you comfortable sharing your age?
Oh, sure, I'm 90.
90 years old, and so this would have occurred when you were around 10, 12, 14 years old, this fire?
I'm thinking, yes. When was it? Was it 30? It was, what was the year of that fire?
Early 40s, I think.
Yeah. Well, see, John Lovering was in high school, and I'm guessing I was probably 14 or 15.
If I was to ask you about major changes in the town of Plymouth over your 9 decades here, what might they be? What changes have you seen happen over time?
Well, that's an enormously encompassing question. I guess it's the profile of the community has changed. When I was growing up, Plymouth was, in this area, a sort of center. We had the Draper Maynard Manufacturing Company here. The peg mill was going full bore, and there were farms around that were functioning, like the George Clark Farm and the Rutherfords and the Hatches and all that. And it was kind of a self-contained community that attracted people to come here to shop, to go to school. And of course, we did have the college here, which we can't ever forget that. I mean, that was growing and at a modest rate, but still it was a place that brought people. It was a little center, and I think Plymouth people were quite proud of it. I think we have lost that identity. Perhaps the college is an important, an enormously important aspect of the community right now, but it seems like with the Interstate Highway and Tenny Mountain Highway, it's just another place along the road. I don't think we have the enthusiastic, entrepreneurial identity of a town that's doing things, and we're just a lot like a lot of towns along the interstate highway, just a place to stop and, get some beer or some gasoline or some whiskey or something. And I don't know that we attract a lot of people to come here anymore. As I was growing up, of course, we had the old Plymouth Hotel. People were attracted here because of the ski business and the ski industry. Mm-hmm. That was, in its infancy. And it was a very fundamental part of growing up in Plymouth, was to see these skiers from, Switzerland and Austria that came here, Wendell and Hilty, for instance. People were attracted to come here for specific things, and I don't think that sense exists anymore. It's just another place along the highway.
Relative to skiing, what mountains would have existed then, ski mountains?
Well, they had skiing on what was called Huckins Hill, which was over in Holderness across the Livermore Falls Bridge, that hill. And there was skiing at Frontenac, the mountain, it's off down to the south end of town. Mm-hmm. And then there was the slope on the other side, Wendy's, so-called. And the Wendy's comes from the name of Wendell and O. Hilty, who was the skier that came here from Switzerland.
So Tenny Mountain didn't exist?
Tenny Mountain did not exist in those early stages. No, Tenny Mountain happened in the 60s. Mm-hmm.
I believe it was 1960 they opened.
Right. I remember, I helped form the corporation. I remember going to Sam Hall's house on Garland Street and sitting with him and John French, and we formed the company. Oh but that was fascinating. Betty and I went to a dinner party at Hall's house, and Walter Stadley, who was the engineer from Switzerland that sold a lot of the equipment for the chairlift, put on a dinner for us, and it was, what is it where you dip meat in things? There's a name for the dinner. You dip things in cheese now. Fondue, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This was a meat fondue, and he put on this fancy dinner at Sam Hall's house, and we all got introduced to his version of a fondue party. And at the end, we all drank a little glass or cup of the broth that all the meat had been cooked in, and chased that down with some alcohol. And I can remember that Mr. Stadley did a very nice thing for Harold Trajano, the local surveyor, because one of the boxes of ski equipment that came here from Switzerland was identifiable as being opened by Mr. Trajano. And when he opened it, Walter Stadley had put in a brand new, up-to-date theodolite that had been made in Switzerland that, advanced some of Trajano's equipment by about 25 years. It was fantastic.
Wow. And so as a result of this meeting, Tenny Mountain Corporation was formed?
Yes.
And then you belonged to some kind of a committee that may have supported them and provided some funds?
What we did, there was a company, part of the CBS, I think it was CBS Electronics. They came to Plymouth and did a labor survey. And I can remember they held it in what used to be the Ford garage, the Pease garage. And they invited people from all over the area to sign up to, indicate a preference or an interest in working for this company. And CBS dropped the ball after a year or so and decided not to come here. But we had already done a labor survey, and it was apparent that there were a lot of people, a lot of women who wanted jobs. So a group of us formed the Pemmy Baker Industrial Development Corporation. I was president, actually. And I can remember your family and others, the shares of stock were $200. And there were a lot of people who put down the $200, and we created this company. And in the process, that inspired Sprague Electric to come here because they used, to some extent, the labor study that had been done by CBS. And they built a plant here in Plymouth, and they increased in an appropriate way the tax base, and they provided this labor market. Unfortunately, they made a capacitor for the electronic industry, and it was involved something called tantalum, and our competitors found a way to make the same product available at less cost by something different from tantalum, whatever that meant, and I don't profess to know anything about that. But unfortunately, Sprague got going, and it went very well for a number of years, but then because they were dependent upon a pretty much one product line, they had to pull in all their horns, and then, of course, the plant closed.
So that led to its demise.
And what?
And that led to its demise.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Did you have a best friend when you were in elementary school?
Oh, sure. George Ray. Well, actually, I had a number. I mean, best, I realize, is the ultimate. But George Ray and Roger Person, Arthur Tuttle, Amin Samaha, Eddie Cole, a whole array of people.
All right. And then, was there a person in your family, perhaps, or in the town that influenced you as a child?
If I were influenced as a child, which of course we all are, it would have been my maternal grandfather, the Scotchman, who he actually had a speech impediment. My mother, I think, was supposed to be called, like her mother, Isabella, but he couldn't say Isabella, so when she was christened, the Ella came out, but not the rest. So she was Ella Batchelder, not Isabella.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
But his name was William Allardyce Fleming, and he had come from the northwest part of Scotland and Arbroath. So Betty and I have visited that place since a number of times. He was the most delightful human being to be around. He loved his work, and he worked with animals, cows and his horse, and he treated them as if, they were all members of the family. He did special things for them. He was very proud of them, and he was very, very honest with the money right down to the penny. This is the Depression. This is going to the market in Meredith, as I did with him, and I mentioned earlier, spending $25, $35, $40 a day for groceries for Woodcrest. That was 2 or 3 times a week's pay for some people.
Major amount.
And in the week, in that daily shot of groceries, there might be, half a pound of tea or something that my grandmother had wanted. And that might have been, 38 cents out of this. But boy, when he got home, he said, I've got to mark in my book. He'd go to his little office, and he would indicate that on that day's grocery list, we owed the company, 50 cents or something. He was a delightful human being, positive, charitable, perhaps too much so. But there was a neighbor who oftentimes got in trouble, and my grandfather was always there to bail him out and help him out.
But that's what people did.
That's right.
That's part of being a community, what's important.
Right.
Do you have memories of the war? We're talking specifically World War II that you participated in?
Well, yes, of course, we all had to get into it. But I think I told you earlier about, the High Y Club being in the radio station when the word came across that we were at war. After that, it was just a given that we were all going to be in the service. And when I was in 17, I joined the Navy. I joined the Navy for no other reason than the fact that my mother's sister, Mary, had married into the Pease family, and her husband had been in the Navy in World War One, and he was thinking seriously about getting back in the Navy in World War II. And I'd heard Navy, 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 so I joined the Navy. And I was deferred, obviously, until I was 18. I had to be old enough to get in. And that's why I went to summer school at the college. And then I went in the service. And almost within 10 days of being 18, I got called up. I went out to Great Lakes, did my training there. I was assigned to some extraordinarily high-tech radio equipment stuff, which I was not able to handle. And I was sent to Gulfport, Mississippi, to learn to be an electrician's mate. So I became one. We were mustered out on the drill field twice when I was in Mississippi. Once was to tell us that President Roosevelt had died and that Harry Truman was our new president. And then we were called out on the drill field a second time, and that was to tell us that Hitler's war was over. He had, done suicide, and I think it was Admiral Dönitz signed the papers that ended the war in Europe. The ship I was assigned to was in Boston, or actually in Newport, Rhode Island, near the Navy base down there. And I became an electrician's mate on that ship. My senior officer on the ship, his name was Archibald Tanner Banning III. He was a lieutenant commander, and his mother her name was Banning, and she had written love stories, I think, for the Collier's magazine and the Saturday Evening Post. Margaret Culkin Banning. So I had him as my senior officer, and unfortunately that poor man, whenever the ship unleashed its ropes to the dock, he became seasick. And he was seasick until we returned. My ship was a diesel electric, which was a very complicated mechanism to turn the screws of the ship, but I stood watching in an engine room, and we did not go to the South Pacific because the ship didn't operate well there. And then the war was over.
And the war was over.
Yeah.
All right. My next question is going to be a little bit about any political upheavals that have affected you over time. At the local level, perhaps, at the state level, and even at the national level. Political upheavals.
I have no memory of what I think in contemporary language you or I could call a political upheaval. There was the usual competition between Democrats and Republicans, but the level of the conflict between the two was, within the four corners of the Constitution, I would say. And I just have no memory of what you would call a political upheaval. I think we may be getting close to one now, and I worry about that, but I don't have a specific memory. The usual Democrat-Republican shifts in power from the governor's level and Congress and Senate here in New Hampshire, but I don't have any memory of a cataclysmic shift. Now, I was too little to remember the Depression being touched off by the stock market crash of '29. That obviously was a political upheaval. But when I became conscious of what was going on in the world, more or less, the Roosevelt administration was well in place and probably in its second or third term, and New Hampshire was no different. So I can't give you anything there.
My last question is going to be, if you were to share something with future generations, what advice, what information, what would you like to share with them?
Oh boy, you know, there's always the basic things: to be honest, to be truthful. Don't make extravagant promises that can't be kept. I guess this goes more with respect to the prior question, but I guess they two can be melded. I feel that democracy, as it was envisioned by the founders, is badly and severely threatened today. The word democracy, if you want to check into the Latin and the French and the Greek and all this and that, means power from the people. And our country, different from other countries in the world, was a country that was built from the bottom up. Power went from the bottom up differently than it had in the country we came from, England, where power came from the top down because of dukes and duchesses and kings and queens and all kinds of royalty. Franklin Roosevelt, and I don't know how I ever ran across this, but somehow in some reach for something, Franklin Roosevelt was nominated to the Democrat position of president for a second term in Philadelphia in 1936. And in his acceptance speech, he mentioned that there were what he called economic royalists. In other words, not the dukes and duchesses, but the people with all the money. And I fear that we are at a point today where we're on the threshold of being governed not from the bottom up, is what democracy is supposed to be about, but from the top down. And it's not because of geographic representation, it's because of the representation of those with enormous, beyond comprehension, wealth. And I think that is a threat to our society and to our form of government. And I think the course needs to be changed and corrected, and the sooner the better.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing. Our time has come to a close. I can't believe an hour has gone by so quickly. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I did, and I think the audience will as well. In the fast-paced world that we live today, we sometimes find ourselves moving so quickly we forget what a community is, our part in a community, and how important it is for us to give back. And it's just been my pleasure to interview today and have you share some of your memories and your thoughts about the town of Plymouth. So I'm thanking you.
And people just have to tell the truth.
Thank you.
That's so important.
Thank you.
Okay.